Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday, the 22nd of February. I'm Katy Balls, the Spectator's political editor and your host for this week. Coming up on the show, Britain's position on the Israel-Gaza conflict has shifted. Once clear Israel had a right to defend itself, now both main political parties are urging the Israeli government to think again when it comes to a ground invasion of Rafah. And this all came to a head in Parliament last night. Joining me to discuss is writer Jake Wallis Simons and journalist Peter Oborne. Also this week, Prince William decided to speak out about the need for peace in the Middle East, calling for an end to all the fighting. Should royal family members wade into global political conflicts? Alexander Larman has written about this for Coffee House, and I'll chat to him later. Has Britain become work shy? With a record number of people on out-of-work benefits, is the system rigged to encourage Brits not to work? Kate Andrews writes about Britain's work fast for this week's cover piece. She joins me on the show now, alongside growth consultant Tony Danker. And finally, the government has proposed a ban on smartphones for children in schools, but does this go far enough? I'll be speaking to the Conservative MP Miriam and head teacher Katherine Birbalsingh about whether smartphones should be banned for all children. Before we get going, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of the video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. First up, as the death toll continues to rise in Gaza, Britain's support for Israel has shifted. Both major parties had urged caution about the idea of a ground invasion of Rafah, and Labour this week has called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. It led to a dramatic evening in Parliament after Speaker Lindsay Hoyle allowed Labour to bring its amendment to vote, upending years of parliamentary procedure. To discuss what the UK's position on Rafah should be, I'm joined by journalist Peter Oborne and writer Jake Wallis Simons. Peter, Jake, thank you for joining Spectator TV this week. So Peter, to begin with you, it feels as though when it comes to the two main parties, there are still a few differences, but generally speaking, the attitude towards Israel has become more hostile in the past week or so. Would you agree with that?
I think I put it in a different way, that to begin with, we had a kind of cross-party merger between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, which was quite fascinating. I mean, Keir Starmer decided not to play the role you'd normally expect in a major issue like this, of being leader of the opposition. He became a sort of subcontractor of Rishi Sunak's foreign policy positions and repeatedly failed to interrogate the British government. And this led that both parties were over-enthusiastic, in my view, in their support for Benjamin Netanyahu's attacks on Gaza. Just think about the devastation we've seen. I mean, we've now got 29,400 dead in a population of, and that's a conservative estimate from the Gaza Health Authority, in a population of 2 million. We have seen a slight move away from that unconditional support. So I wouldn't say it's towards hostility to Israel, but I would say a little bit less friendly towards Israel.
And Jake, we're talking about the changing attitudes towards Israel's actions in Gaza. If the Israeli ground operation invasion of Rafah goes ahead, we can expect widespread condemnation. There's lots of efforts right now to try and dissuade the Israeli government from taking that step. Why is it, do you think, that the IDF do see it as a needed step?
Well, because that's, as I said, Hamas's last redoute. Hamas had about, I think, 24 battalions to begin with in the war. Most of them had been destroyed or disrupted significantly. But I think there are about 4 or so stationed in Rafah. And if they are not countered and destroyed, then Hamas will grow back and take power again. Well, that's the danger. They certainly won't be out of the picture. Rafah is particularly important because that's where the smuggling tunnels exist from Egypt into Gaza, which is where Hamas learned how to tunnel, really, back in the 80s and 90s. And so Hamas will be able to rearm via those tunnels if they're not taken out in Rafah. And overall, I think we need to look at the bigger picture, which is that Hamas has genocidal intentions towards Israel. It has carried out October the 7th, demonstrating that it will do whatever it can to carry out those intentions as best it can. It has clearly stated that it will do it again and again and again in the future until, in its view, Israel is destroyed. There is no alternative for Israel but to destroy Hamas while trying as best as possible to limit civilian casualties. And that must involve rooting Hamas out of Rafah, ideally with getting as many civilians out of the way as possible, which the IDF, as I understand, is working quite carefully on at the moment in terms of the planning stage.
Peter, do you think it would be a mistake?
Well, I think that it would be terrible if Israel were to go into Rafah. I mean, it's a tent city now. There's almost nowhere in Gaza for people to live. And already the deaths, as I explained, it's as if there were 1 million deaths in Britain. The rate of attrition over the last 5 months was in Britain. And God, I really pray that this doesn't happen. It would be a terrible mistake also by Israel, because for all kinds of reasons. By the way, I just want to say politely that I don't really recognize Jake's idea that there's been wall-to-wall sort of positive media coverage in the mainstream media for Palestine. My view is pretty well the opposite, actually. The mainstream media, by which I mean the Associated, the Murdoch Press, the Express newspapers, Telegraph, have been, generally speaking, extremely pro-Israel. If you look at it, so often it's quite upsetting, actually, the dehumanization of Palestinians. Palestinians in news reports, they just mysteriously die, whereas Israelis are killed. And I find that, and generally speaking, the media in Britain has thrown its weight behind the cross-party consensus between Labour and the Tories in favour of the continuation of what has become, I'm afraid, a barbarous war.
I mean, Peter, obviously I agree with you on a couple of points. The first is that the civilian death toll is I mean, I'm not sure what the right adjective is, but civilian deaths are appalling. Of course they are. And I wouldn't for a moment want to suggest that I'm minimizing that in any way. But I think I would differ from you in terms of where I ascribe the blame. The IDF is taking measures that are unprecedented in modern warfare to try to limit those civilian casualties, as the Americans have confirmed. And yet Hamas is trying to put civilians in harm's way. Indeed, it constructed the battlefield in order to kill as many of its own civilians as possible, in order to evoke the kind of public outrage which is being expressed widely across the West. But I would say that Israel really has been left between a rock and a hard place. It cannot allow this genocidal enemy to exist, and yet whenever it tries to fight back, Hamas is trying to get its own civilians killed in order to turn the world against it. But in terms of that media coverage, I would agree with you that on the whole, the right-wing press in this country, the Telegraph in particular, Daily Mail, the Sun, the Times to an extent, has been behind Israel. But really I was referring to the broadcast media. I think with the broadcast media, for a start, there has been an obsessive focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, eclipsing all other conflicts in the world by an order of magnitude. And there has been a constant thread of bias, not necessarily intentional, coming through that reporting. Just to offer you two examples. One is, of course, the strike on the Al-Ahli hospital, which was a misfired Islamic Jihad missile, which was pinned on Israel immediately by the world's broadcast media in particular, and followed by the press. And the second is the fact, ask yourself, when did you last see any footage coming out of Gaza of a dead Hamas fighter, a dead combatant? The answer will be never, because Hamas censors the media and limits what journalists are exposed to, so that the West is constantly subjected to a barrage of pictures of civilian casualties, making out as if Israel is waging a war on civilians. It is not. It is expressly not.
Well, we'll disagree. I think even the broadcast media, BBC, Sky, ITV in this country has, generally speaking, given Israel a very fair crack of the whip. And there's been all kinds of misreporting out of Israel that which were accepted much too uncritically, in my view, such as this massive sort of complex under Al-Shifa hospital, which is yet to be any proof for, apart from a few faked videos issued by the IO.
That's not true. They're not fake videos. That it has been proven. It
was well established. We'll come, but it was well established actually that there was immediately afterwards, in order to give some.
No. It has been confirmed.
And I just say to you, Jake, I would pass on to the IDF. They really haven't done themselves any favours by these fake videos which they've been issuing.
There are no fake videos, Peter. I'm afraid that's incorrect.
Or we'll
under the hospital is an established fact, verified by both Israeli and American intelligence, with evidence.
Look, America cannot be regarded
as fake is profoundly wrong.
Pay more attention, I think I would say to you. But anyway, America cannot be regarded either as an impartial party in this. It's a partial. Joe Biden's wonderful Freudian.
So you say that the Americans are in some way part of a conspiracy of fake news?
I didn't say they are part of a conspiracy of fake. They are not an impartial party in this conflict.
But they have confirmed the tunnels under the hospital. Are you saying that they are a part of a conspiracy pushing fake news?
I'm not part of it. I'm not going into conspiracy theories, by the way.
Peter, if we're looking at, I suppose, beyond the media, if we're looking at what key allies are saying, you mentioned America, it's quite clear from the comments this week, the warnings against Israel not to embark on this operation in Rafah, that if they do press on, you're probably going to have the widest international condemnation of Israel's efforts since the original attack. Do you think that is something that will change Israel's behaviour or will be irrelevant?
I don't know, because I can't see into the mind of Mr. Netanyahu. So I do remember, and I think something has changed, though, between the relationship between the United States and Israel. We've been here before. If you go back 40 years to South Lebanon in 1982, Reagan rang up the Israelis and said, the American president said, stop it, stop the atrocities. And within 20 minutes, they'd stopped. There was no there was a sense, Maggie Thatcher called what the Israelis were doing in southern Lebanon pure barbarism. And what we have now is a new reluctance on the West to be a candid friend to Israel and say, look, what you're doing now is utterly unacceptable. It's barbarous. It's doing Israel no favors. It's creating enemies everywhere. And anyway, if you claim to be the greatest democracy in the Middle East and a representative of Western values, no, you don't go around doing what we've seen for the last 4 months, or what Israel was doing in South Lebanon. I wish that Joe Biden had the same willingness that Ronnie Reagan had, a Republican president, to confront Israeli leaders and saying, no, what you're doing is unacceptable, call it off, which is what Reagan was ready to do. And Biden, only 4 or 5 months into this, is at last showing signs that maybe Rafah is a step too far, which indeed it is.
Well, I mean, in response, I would just say that it's quite extraordinary that the way that the world view that Peter has just been putting forward of the war hasn't mentioned either the fact that Hamas started it with the worst atrocities against Jews since the Holocaust, or the fact that it continues to hold Israeli hostages and has not released them, or the fact that it has pledged to carry out October the 7th again and again and again until Israel is destroyed, or the fact that it is based on a jihadi ideology which is committed, fanatically committed, to the destruction first of the Jews, then to the establishment of a caliphate, and then subsequently to the subjugation of the Christians and of our Western democratic way of life. All of that seems to have been edited out of the narrative, and instead we've been presented with a version of events which is simply an unprovoked aggression by Israel, which is a war against civilians. It's fantasy land. Israel is a Western-style democracy. It's the only democracy in the Middle East. It has been appallingly attacked by a genocidal enemy from a territory from which it withdrew entirely in 2005. It's been attacked within its internationally recognized borders by this jihadi enemy, the same jihadi enemy which would be coming for us and will be if they're not defeated in Gaza, by the way. It's responding according to the rules of law, the rules of war, trying to protect civilians as best it can with unprecedented measures to do so. And to put forward a narrative that this is some sort of Israeli genocide, that the Jews love the killing of babies and so forth, feels to me really quite medieval and totally abstracted from the facts on the ground and from the reality.
Jake, of course, in the introduction, we have been referring to the original Hamas attack. And I think that obviously there are some people who don't mention that. But I think if we talk about what the main debate really happening amongst Western allies about Israel's next step is, it's whether, given the death toll in Gaza is now so high, there are 1 million Palestinians over in Rafah, can the Israeli government really justify going in and upping the civilian death toll even more in the pursuit of trying to eradicate Hamas? And that seems to be the point where the Americans and others are moving against it. So to that, I mean, do you think that if Israel looks isolated and alone in doing this, that is something that is going to change their motives? Or actually, is Israel willing to be internationally very isolated as a result?
Well, I mean, I know that there has been within Israel, within the Israeli war cabinet, a split, a divergence of views with regard to Rafah. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been pushing to carry out the Rafah assault and finish the war before Ramadan. That was his initial position. Of course, as Peter mentioned, he is part of a coalition with some right-wing extremists who are really quite unpleasant characters, and he's relying upon them for his political power, which is dragging him to a more extreme position, I feel. But then the other members of the war cabinet have been recognizing that Rafah is an essential battleground. Hamas needs to be rooted out of there, but has been wanting, the IDF in particular, has been wanting to have the time to prepare to evacuate civilians from that area, which, by the way, is not very easy because, as Peter mentioned, the rest of Hamas, the rest of Gaza is almost inhabitable, for one thing. And secondly, Hamas tries to infiltrate civilian populations and will try to filter out amongst the civilians. So vetting is going to be difficult. So it's a huge logistical operation. But then what happened last week was that Benny Gantz said that Hamas had a deadline of the beginning of Ramadan, which is in a few weeks' time, to release the hostages, at which point Israel would stand down and not attack Rafah. So that gives Israel that period of time to prepare and to try to limit these civilian casualties as much as it can. I reiterate that my position, the position of every thinking and feeling human being, and the position of the vast majority in Israel, and in particular in the Israeli army, is that every innocent Palestinian death is deplorable and regrettable and horrendous. And I wish that Hamas had not started this war, because then Gaza would not be destroyed and Israel wouldn't be forced to take the action that it is being forced into doing. And just to your final point about the international community, I mean, it seems to me that the messaging that has been coming from America about Rafah was not so much don't do it, but don't do it like this. Don't do it with all the civilians still there, with catastrophic civilian casualties and a humanitarian disaster. But I think if I was Hamas, if I was sitting in Rafah listening to the messaging from the US, I would be still worried that Israel would find a way to take away my human shields and come for me. And hopefully that is what will happen.
And Peter, if we're talking about the eradication of Hamas, which Israel is saying once it has got there, then their mission will be complete. Effectively, can there really be any lasting peace in Palestine while Hamas are there, given they are against a two-state solution?
Well, I would like to answer that question by just challenging a statement made by Jake. I mean, he rightly said, what about the Hamas atrocities? We've all dealt with those. They're disgusting, foul. And but what about the genocidal? What the Western media has been very slow to do is talk about the genocidal statements made by senior Israelis and then echoed right down the ranks. You'll all have seen these horrifying TikTok videos of Israeli soldiers making horrible statements and revolting behavior vis-a-vis Palestinians. But right at quoted in the International Court of Justice report is a very long document setting out the genocidal statements made by very senior Israelis. And so I will turn that question on its head. can there be peace in the region while you have people like Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir running the Israeli state?
What do you say to that, Jake?
These statements, I mean, if you look at TikTok, if TikTok was around in World War II filming the British forces, of course there would be...
Don't slag off British forces, please. No, I'm not going to have British forces compared to the behaviour of which we have seen on TikTok. No, you've gone too far. Do not attack the British Army in World War II.
I mean, if TikTok was around in any warfare engaged in by the democracies, by the British Army, or the Americans, or any other Western armed forces, including in World War II, if TikTok was there, soldiers would be making objectionable videos, because war is a brutal affair. War is hell, and even a just and defensive war is as hellish as any other war, or it can be. And so I think to point at TikTok and take your news from there and accuse Israel of genocide because it's such stupid soldiers making idiotic videos, I think is wrong. Many of the comments that people have objected to made by senior Israeli figures have been mistranslated. There have been some objectionable comments made by Israeli figures, none of them really in many key positions of responsibility, by the way, but it's all been magnified and blown out of proportion. But to form some kind of moral equivalence between villains on the Israeli side, like any other country, Israel has its villains, of course it does. To draw moral equivalence between the villains on the Israeli side, which is basically it's a Western-style democratic country defending itself against a genocidal enemy, and a fundamentally jihadi, fanatical regime in Gaza that actually has as its objective to kill as many Jews as possible while putting its own civilians in harm's way. Every civilian killed on either side is a victory for Hamas and a loss for Israel. To create some kind of moral equivalence, to triangulate between good and evil, I think, is a grave sort of abnegation of morality. The truth is that Israel, of course, as I say, has its villains like any other country, but it is not a jihadi regime. And in terms of the hope for peace, Israel would come to the table and would approve a two-state solution tomorrow, I believe, if its security was assured from the Palestinian side, 70% of which is polling support for Hamas at this time.
Can I'm very upset about something Jake said there. My grandfather served in World War II. So both my grandfathers did. My father was a career British Army soldier. Most of my family have some connection with the British Army or British Navy. The British Army did not behave did not behave the way the IDF and are doing. We're seeing the most horrible things happening on these TikTok videos and elsewhere and other coverage, shooting down, an old mum walking through the streets, a grandma in the streets. Now, if that had happened in the British Army, I want to educate you a little bit here about the British Army, Jake. That soldier or officer would have been immediately arrested and court-martialed, because that's what a decent army does. And the British Army, which fought World War II, and my grandfather fought it, and my other grandfather in the Navy, that would never have been passed muster. What we are seeing is obscenities from the IDF. And it's over. Don't dismiss it. And I think you've got to deal with this. That something horrible is going on in the IDF.
Peter, both of my grandfathers also served very proudly in the RAF. So I went to the election.
I honour them, and they wouldn't have committed those atrocities which we're seeing from the IDF either.
What I will say is perhaps it's a mistake to take your information too much from TikTok. And also, if you seek to encourage me to be educated about World War II, I would encourage you in return to think about the firebombing of Dresden, in which British forces killed 25,000 German men, women and children in a single night. So don't lecture me about the morality of the British Army.
So you're comparing what Israel is doing in Gaza to Dresden. That's a very interesting comparison.
If I may finish, Peter. Like you, I believe that the British Army is among the most moral in the world. And it does court-martial anybody who acts out of line, as does the Israeli army, by the way, which is fighting an existential war equivalent to ours in World War II. Court-martials exist in the Israeli forces as well as in the British armed forces, and the TikTok stuff about Israeli people gunning down Palestinians in cold blood, I would very much advise a dose of caution in taking your news from TikTok.
These are all authenticated cases. Many of them have, unfortunately, been proven. I'd like to see the evidence. I hope the Israeli Defense Forces are indeed arresting, court-martialing and punishing very severely what seems to be cold-blooded murder carried out in many of these videos we've seen, not just on TikTok, by the way. It's a very serious matter. If we are, as a civilized country, we in Britain, who can be very proud of our armed forces, I know there have been the occasion, but are going to support Israel, we need to know that we are supporting a country which has the civilized values which we hold in Britain. And the conduct...
Which it does, unlike Hamas, by the way.
I'm not defending Hamas. I've condemned them repeatedly. I've never had no trouble at all. I condemn anybody who abuses human rights, who murders in cold blood. I condemn anybody wherever they come from.
But it's just strange that when Katy asked about the two-state solution and possibilities for peace, and would it be possible with Hamas still in existence, you then said, well, what about the Israeli genocide?
I didn't. It's a false. What I pointed out. No, you were.
You criticise Hamas with one sentence, but then veer off onto the Israelis very, very quickly indeed.
No, I pointed when you talked about Hamas, the atrocities they you said they committed. I said what we need to bear in mind also the genocidal comments made by the as the International Court of Justice has demonstrated, made by very senior Israeli politicians, including the president, including the prime minister, and also we see them on TikTok. Well, that's why you mustn't misrepresent, Jake, in a conversation as grave as this, what I'm saying.
I wouldn't dream of it, Peter.
Good, I'm glad about that.
And with that, I think we're going to have to wrap this one up. So thank you, Jake. Thank you, Peter, for joining today. Also this week, Prince William went against convention by speaking out that all killing must end in Gaza. Joining me now to discuss whether it's such a wise intervention is regular Spectator contributor and royal author Alexander Larman. Alexander, thank you for coming on Spectator TV this week. Now, it's a pivotal moment in the Israel-Gaza conflict with a potential ground operation, lots of Western allies warning against, tense moment. And we had a curious intervention this week, perhaps not the one we were expecting ahead of this. Prince William.
Well, there's this royal adage that you should never complain, never explain. I think we should add to that, you should never get involved in international politics, because one of the things about the royal family has been that they've always stayed quiet when it comes to this kind of very loaded political intervention. And what we had from Prince William back in October was we had a statement condemning the terrorist attack that Hamas committed on 7th of October. But now he's gone rather further, and he's essentially suggested that there should be an immediate ceasefire, which is a lot further than the government's going. And this statement came out of nowhere. I mean, nobody was expecting it, and it certainly wasn't as if anyone was calling on him to get involved. So the question that we're all asking is, why did he do it? Did anyone put him up to it? And what's the result of it going to be?
Yeah, it does not feel as though it's the intervention that's going to swing what happens in the coming days. And as you say, you've had Number 10, I think, briefing to suggest that they're not unsupportive of Prince William saying this. But what do you think compelled him to take a stand?
Well, I mean, if you believe the rumours that Ed Balls has been putting about, it's that Lord Cameron put a fatherly hand on his shoulder and said, now's the time for you to get involved, now's the time for you to make a statement. But this is so unprecedented that you can't imagine that anyone, let alone the Foreign Secretary, would actually have thought it was a good idea, because not a single person in this country was thinking, I wonder what Prince William's views on the ceasefire are. And what was interesting is my first response was rather in support of the government, it supported Keir Starmer, because it seemed to be siding quite closely with Starmer's own perspective on what's going to be happening with the ceasefire. So, I mean, you have to ask, where does William stand on all this? Because the statement was quite ambiguous. I mean, he's for his counsel of despair, which is a terrible phrase, but it's also the same one that Rishi Sunak used.
It's curious timing in the sense that obviously King Charles having to step back from full-time royal duties. He did meet with the Prime Minister this week. So is Prince William trying to fill the vacuum left by King Charles? And do we think King Charles would have said this?
But it's funny in the same way Prince William was at the BAFTAs, which is a completely different kind of event, and I think instinctively one he seems more comfortable with.
He's packing a lot in.
Yeah. Well, he's a busy man, obviously. His wife's not very well at the moment, so he's obviously going to be dealing with all that as well privately. But in terms of his public role, I don't think it was a very good idea. And of course, what you have to ask is who's advising him. And the question is, does Kensington Palace want him to be taking a more proactive role in terms of this stuff? Because if you look at his father, I mean, from probably the early 90s onwards, Charles was getting involved in politics, obviously behind the scenes. He wasn't making any public statements, but the Black Spider memos and things like that very much gave the sense that he was an interventionist prince who wants to have his voice heard. But William's gone a step further because he's making public statements. He's not leaning on the government privately, which is what you might expect him to do. And so you have to ask, is he doing this because he's genuinely interested in the humanitarian impulse? Is he doing it because somebody's told him to? Or is he doing it because he wants to have a higher profile and he wants to essentially put himself out there?
Are you leaning to any of the three?
I would like to keep an open mind at the moment because, I mean, as ever with any of the royal family, it's quite hard to see what the end game is, because I think that what we have to ask of the royal family, especially with Charles being indisposed, is there a power struggle brewing? Because we can never know for certain. I mean, obviously, the royal family has presented itself for a long time as harmonious and one big happy family, which of course we know they're not. But given all the attendant Prince Harry controversy, I mean, Harry wanting to come back to Britain and offering to step in as being a part-time working royal again, it's as if William's looked at all that and thought, whatever he can do, I can do better. Because I think that obviously the two brothers hate each other, but there's also a sense of competitiveness, and there's been there since childhood. And so you can see that William is probably feeling that he hasn't had a high enough public profile lately, he hasn't been doing enough, and so this is, I think, his way of reasserting himself.
And what's the precedent here for this type of intervention when it comes to the royal family? Because it's hard to imagine the Queen taking this route.
Well, I think you've got to go back to the Duke of Windsor for things like this. I mean, the Duke of Windsor went to the depressed Welsh mining town in 1936, and he said something must be done about this. These men must be got back to work. And obviously, that seems quite mild to us today. But back then, the idea of the king openly taking a political stance was absolutely unheard of. So I think you've got to go back to that to have any sort of comparison. Because no, the Queen never said or did anything. I mean, there was obviously her private comments about Scottish independence and indeed Brexit, which
also involved David Cameron, the Scottish independence one. So perhaps there is a common theme there if Ed Balls is correct.
Well, I mean, Ed Balls could very well be correct. He's a very well-connected man. So it's perfectly possible that, yes, that David Cameron did have a hand in the statement, because it's a very terse statement, which I think is obviously the intention, but it does raise more questions than it answers.
And I suppose, in a way, as much as this intervention, I think, has surprised various people this week, it does fit into a trend of the younger royals talking more, being more politically engaged. And in a way, that did slightly begin with King Charles, if we think about his eco-activism. So is this a trend that perhaps is just going to grow and grow?
Well, if you go back to Charles and his Prince of Wales and his eco-activism and his interest in architecture, I mean, they were sincerely held, but they were also quite harmless. I mean, nothing he was doing had any particular insight into the politics of the day. But certainly, I mean, I think that William and Harry, in completely separate ways, are both very happy to be going out there, saying their truth, saying what they believe. And yes, it's only going to get stronger, isn't it? Because once you've let the genie out of the bottle, you can't really have a situation where you're not offering your views. And I think what's very interesting is that we don't know what's going to happen in the conflict. We have absolutely no way of knowing how it's all going to be resolved. But we now know exactly how the man who's going to be king one day feels about it. And I don't rule out the idea there'll be further statements in the future, because in a sense, now he set this precedent, why shouldn't there be?
And you touched on that, but I suppose the final question to you, how then do you think this is going to play out over the next year? Do you think we're going to have Prince William, perhaps inadvertently, now being drawn into a situation where he has to comment more? Or do you think those around him will be saying, be a bit careful?
Well, I wonder if he's enjoying all this, because I feel that for quite a long time, he's felt a bit marginalised, because between his younger brother and his father, he hasn't had much of a chance to let his voice be heard. Because you look at him at the BAFTAs, and obviously I think he's enjoying himself, but that's very much the kind of thing that, say, Prince Edward would be doing. It's not the sort of thing you would expect the heir to the throne to be doing. So getting involved at this sort of level, I think, is actually making him feel like a statesman, and I'd be surprised if this is the last time that we heard from him over the next year, 2 years, 5 years, or whatever in these matters, because I think the adrenaline of the public response is what drives him, and it'd be very interesting to see what comes next.
Thank you for joining SpectatorTV today. With unemployment rates at a record low, it would be normal to think that the labour market is in a healthy place. Not so much, according to Kate Andrews. She writes for the cover piece this week about the record number of people on out-of-work benefits and the disincentive at the top of the system too. She joins me now alongside Tony Danker, founder of Growth Incorporated. Kate, Tony, thank you for joining Spectator TV this week. Kate, you write this week's cover piece, Work Fast. What's the fast?
The difficulty, indeed one of the biggest economic crises the UK is possibly facing, certainly in the medium term, is the struggle to get people back into work. During the pandemic, of course, we had the furlough scheme, mass scheme to keep people to stay at home, paying their wages when their employers couldn't keep that up. But in the drive to get people back to work, we've seen some very worrying signs. And this is true across the income spectrum. So, when we talk about work-shy Britain, there's a tendency in that narrative to lean into people who are on benefits. That is part of the story. That is by no means the full story. For example, you had 400,000 workers over the age of 50 who left the workforce during COVID, and only about half of them have come back. Now, in some circumstances, those people will be set. They worked hard, they're set, they're good to go, they don't need the additional income. But in many of those circumstances, they may do. And we've actually seen people falling into poverty when they've left the workforce too soon. We have an issue of the number of people in out-of-work benefits rising to 5.6 million. We are struggling deeply to get people into the workforce at a time when we have over 900,000 job vacancies. The labor market is tight. Employers are desperate to get people into work. And even with record numbers of immigration, 745,000 net migration in 2022, we're still struggling to fill those jobs. So it isn't as if native workers can't get the jobs. It isn't as if they're being taken from them. The jobs are there, and a lot of people, for varying reasons, are choosing not to work. The piece looks into the systems around this, and if we have an issue, I think we do, where much of work is being disincentivized, that it isn't simply about work ethic, it's about whether or not the system rewards you properly for your work. I think in many cases it doesn't.
I want to tune to some of the detail of that, but I suppose for some of those watching right now, we also have a government that likes to talk a lot about record low unemployment. Mm-hmm. So how do we square that with this idea that the workforce is not working?
That's such an important point. So unemployment is at a near record low of 3.8%. One of the benefits of the furlough scheme is that it kept employment from getting much over 5% from memory at the time. And it was really hailed as a success. But that number, that 3.8%, is only taking into account people who are actively looking for work. So it's actually quite deceptive. If you are not actively looking for work, and millions of people are not, you don't fit into that number.
Tony, what do you think is driving this increase in worklessness?
Well, I think the thing that's really confusing, which Kate brilliantly brings out in the story, is we all know that COVID had an impact, right? We all know it had an impact towards that sort of non-habit of work. We all know it had an impact on people in their 50s wanting to retire early, people redressing work-life balance, the great resignation, the great, reset. But it seems to happening more in Britain than in other countries. That's what's so stark about the piece, right? In other countries, you see that, yes, there was that COVID effect, but a lot of people came back to work. In Britain, less people have come back to work. And I think government policy assumed that, given that we're living in a world of high inflation, given the cost of living crisis, actually, in the end, people would run out of money. They'd run out of money and they'd come back, and some have, but not as much as in other countries. So there's clearly something going on in Britain.
Kate, one of the things your piece gets into is the fact that this disincentive for work is on both ends of the spectrum. So you have those who are looking at the benefit system and thinking, if I work, am I actually going to lose more in benefits than I will gain in a working wage? And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have those thinking, should I take on extra work if I'm actually going to hit these tax rates, which mean, is it really worth the extra effort? Can you talk us through that?
The Tories have made a lot of tax changes in the past few years, and one of those major ones has been to freeze tax thresholds, and this creates fiscal drag. It's a stealth tax. It drags people into paying tax, into paying higher rates of tax. And one example I name in the piece is that income tax being paid by a cleaner working 35 hours a week on the minimum wage is going to be almost 50% higher due to fiscal drag. Nobody would have designed the system that way. That is not fair. That is ridiculous that that's happening. But some of the people who are going to be the most disincentivized by changes to the tax system are people at the lowest end of the income spectrum. Then towards the top of the income spectrum, you have other disincentives as well. Nobody's going to be sitting around feeling terribly sad for these people or mourning their losses, but there's something very strange about the fact that the most recent childcare policy designed by Jeremy Hunt to try to keep more women in work, to extend free childcare hours, completely cuts off if the family reaches £100,000 worth of income. And it's gone. There's no taper, there's no nothing. So if you do that bit too well, if you push your income over a certain level, you lose a huge benefit. Now, I like to discuss whether or not people on higher income should be getting all that kind of welfare, but perhaps that's a different discussion. But the system is set up to try to hold back on the pay raise, to try to hold back on doing a bit better for yourself. If we want meaningful economic growth in this country, and we are talking about work-shy Britain in the context of a recession being announced at the end of last year, we need to be inspiring everybody to be working more and thinking that work pays at the very bottom, at the very top of the income spectrum. That is how we get meaningful economic growth. That is how the government gets higher tax receipts and can actually hand some of that hard-earned money back. And until we address, I think, the wide range of tax disincentives, benefit disincentives, I think we're really going to struggle to see that meaningful growth.
Yeah, I think the key phrase there was a phrase we always use in welfare reform, which is making work pay. And it just feels like that for a whole range of reasons, making work or working harder isn't paying. And I think there's definitely these cliff edges in the tax and benefits system, right, which stops making work pay. We can talk about why the Treasury does that all the time. There are other things as well, right? Young people, I think, don't feel they're going to be able to afford to buy a house because of the nature of the housing market. So the idea that was probably true in my generation of you worked like crazy, you worked every hour, you tried to get a higher salary so you could get a mortgage, so you get on the housing ladder, that feels less of a driver. So it makes work pay less. The childcare issue, right? If I'm going to have to afford unbelievably unaffordable childcare, that makes work pay less. So I think that principle, make work pay, make working harder pay, make getting promoted pay, we have to find that again in the system somehow.
Originally, when we were discussing cover ideas on Monday and feeling close to what is now obviously a fantastic cover, Kate.
Thanks, Katy.
We were talking about work shy, and that was the initial idea, which was, is it the case that Brits are actually just become a bit lazy, they don't want to do proper work? Do you think there's an element of that here, or do you think it's more about the system disincentivizing?
No, I think it's the system. I think Kate points out in the piece that actually we had pretty high levels of work and work participation before the pandemic. Something has happened as a result of the pandemic, and it's happened worse in Britain. Now, look, there is this cultural thing that's happened because of COVID, and it's happened around the world. It is a global phenomenon that people are redressing work-life balance.
Remote working.
Remote working is changing the way people feel about work, and older people are, frankly, sitting it out and drawing down their set. So there are a lot of things going on that are cultural, that are about attitudes to work, but I don't think that British people have gone from being not work-shy 4 years ago to work-shy today.
And Kate, you've got some very interesting stats in your piece, aided by John Neal in our research department, about how we compare our European counterparts and what might have happened otherwise.
Yeah, it's really depressing. If the proportion of people in the UK workforce had kept pace with Canada, we'd have close to 1 million additional people in the workforce. If they had kept pace with the United States, it's 700,000. If they had kept pace with France, it's 1.2 million. And our Spectator data hub, thanks to John O'Neill, calculated that if we had stayed on a similar trajectory in terms of employment levels from 2019 onwards, then the economy would be 1.7% bigger, and we could have potentially avoided what is a very shallow recession last year. And, you would have to say that the factors were exactly the same, and they might not have been. But the point is, and I think this is the really difficult thing for politicians to admit, they know there's a very serious problem here, and they know it's holding them back, and they have no idea what to do about it, because to Tony's point, the systems have kind of got out of control in a way that they can't fix overnight. One of the huge problems that I address in the piece is that it's very clear that our health systems and our welfare systems don't know how to tackle mental health issues. And there is a push at the moment, and I again, it wasn't designed this way, but there is a leaning towards signing people off, even though for some people, for many people, frankly, one of the solutions to their particular mental health issue might be to stay in work, at least in some capacity, might be to stay around people, might be to wake up in the morning and go to work and to do something productive. That won't be true for everybody, but our systems are just in absolutely no state to actually deal with the individuals in front of them when it comes to these mental health issues. Of course, we have so many more post-COVID. They were discovered during COVID. They were created during lockdowns. We have people desperate for help. This also contributes to those long-term sickness numbers, 2.8 million now. One of the biggest worries for me looking at the data is that number has continued to surge upwards after lockdowns, after the pandemic. There's something very rotten happening within our systems, that people aren't being targeted with enough time to help them. They're not being properly helped when they are found. And because of it, these individuals are having a tough time. The economy is in a worse place. I mean, we're all worse off because we're not able to get people the help they need.
I think this is a really big opportunity to consider something quite radically different. And I've talked about before, we need a national occupational health revolution. I did call it at the beginning a national occupational health service, but actually asking the government to do it, asking the NHS to do it is a terrible idea. Employers, I think, have already recognized that they need to get into the employee well-being business, particularly around mental health, that actually there's no way the NHS is going to deal with it. There's no way the welfare system is going to deal with it. That the NHS has got so much on its plate just to deal with sickness that the idea that it's going to be able to do wellness anytime soon is unrealistic. And so employers, I think, are now getting in the business of providing wellness. Mental health, preventative care, what people in the system call occupational health. I think that's going to become absolutely mainstream activity in the private sector. We could have a big philosophical argument about whether or not that should be the private sector's job, but because there are 900,000 vacancies, because the NHS and the welfare system isn't going to deal with that problem, I think employers are going to take this into their own hand, and they're going to start to have a wellness offer that get people back to work, even though they may feel that they're in desperate mental health or in desperate physical health. Employers are going to start creating the pathways back.
And what do you think that looks like? Are we talking in-office therapist? Are we talking exercise classes? Obviously, there's interesting data at the moment suggesting exercise can be as if not more effective than some antidepressants. Or, what kind of methods do you think they might use?
I think we're talking about all those things. I think we're talking about health checks for all, and in turn, a range of services that are specifically focused on people with difficult mental health problems or physical disability, making it far more accessible for them to come back to work. So I think employers will help people diagnose and manage their own health. I think they'll help introduce health and wellness services. And the other thing employers will have to do, which they haven't really started to do, is to think about new pathways and flexibility at work, right? We're just going to have to get used to patterns of part-time work. We're going to have to work out how you're going to bring somebody in their late 50s back into a workplace that's dominated by people in their 20s and 30s and add real value. I think employers are only at the foothills of dealing with that question. But certainly, I think most employers now feel the NHS isn't going to solve this problem. I don't know if the politicians in the tax system is going to solve this problem. I better solve it myself.
And Kate, of course, we have a Conservative government that repeatedly says it's taking lots of measures to try and deal with the workforce issue. We have a budget early next month. But in a way, the elephant in the room is if the polls are anything to go by, soon enough, there won't be a Tory government, there'll be a Labour government. Do you think it's going to impact many of the things we're discussing in terms of whether it's positive or negative?
Well, if that Labour Party is serious about getting economic growth, they're going to have to tackle this issue. But they're going to be looking at how difficult that has been for the Tory government, really since the pandemic. And they're going to be nervous to criticise it because if they criticise it, they're going to need solutions. Look, the changes, bringing in universal credit back in the 2010s and getting the UK to record high employment levels, the Tories have proven you certainly can make meaningful change. But it takes time, and unfortunately for them, a lot of those benefits have been swept away, certainly in the data. The Labour Party is going to have to come up with a proper medium-term solution to getting more people back into work, and that's not always going to be the most popular stuff. I think the question is going to be, whether or not they have the political will to do it, and whether or not they have their own kinds of medium-term solutions, because right now, what's been very clear over the past few years is that, putting a bit more investment into job centers, trying to get more resources, that is not doing it. That's not moving the dial really at all. You're going to have to stop the trajectory of all of these numbers of out-of-work benefits, long-term sickness shifting upwards. And to Tony's point, that's going to have to be done at a very fundamental level. We are talking about all kinds of health. We're talking about all kinds of well-being. We're talking about all kinds of employment. And that's going to need a full plan, none of which we've seen from the Labour Party.
And just if I may about Labour, because I worked in the last Labour government, and I don't think you are going to see anything from Labour on this before an election. But I do think Labour in government will tackle with this. You know, I worked in a Labour government where we talked endlessly about welfare reform, Gordon Brown welfare to work programmes. You know, Labour is, in theory, the party of work, right? And so I think a Labour government will grasp this. And I think the ideological and the trade union relationships won't get in the way of them tackling it. However, we should also remember that one of the reasons we have all these fall-offs in the system is that it's designed by the Treasury, who basically have always felt that all this clever tapering, all this complexity in the tax system is ineffective, creates complexity, creates fraud. So they will be heavily resistant to us trying to smooth these cliff edges. But I think in the end, you're right. I think a Labour government will come in, and if they don't stand for work paying, then they'll run out of road pretty quickly.
Final question to you both, because it's been a very interesting discussion, but perhaps not the most uplifting. So, any reasons to be hopeful?
Well, I'll just say I think employers are tackling it. I think we are, people are not in business sitting, folding their arms and saying, right, we need the NHS to work, because they realise that's going to take a long time. I think that, yes, employers do like more immigration, but they also recognise, every day employers have got massive amounts of sickness they're now tackling with, mental health problems. So my note of optimism, good one for the Spectator, is that the private sector is taking this into their own hands.
My point of optimism is that the opportunities are there, unlike previous recessions where people are losing their jobs or they have no job options and they don't have them for years. If you do want to work right now, or if you feel underemployed, if you want a different type of job, if you want more pay, if you want more flexibility, the worker's in a pretty strong position right now to go out there and find what they're looking for. That's a wonderful place for workers to be in. So, if we can jump some of those hurdles, if we can deal with a lot of those underlying issues and get people to a place where they want a job or they want a different kind of job, that can be delivered.
Kate, Tony, thank you very much. And finally, the government has proposed a ban of smartphones in schools. With 97% of kids in the UK owning a smartphone by the age of 12, is this a realistic policy? And what about the calls for the government to go further and ban smartphones more generally? Joining me to discuss is Conservative MP Miriam Cates and head teacher Katherine Birbalsingh. Miriam, as of this week, schools have been given new guidance about limiting the use of mobile phones. How is this different to what was happening before?
Well, I don't think the guidance is statutory, so it won't necessarily change anything overnight. But I do think it gives a clear signal that phones are not welcome in classrooms. The government thinks they're a bad idea. Clearly, there are some schools that are doing a good job of this. They are keeping phones out of classrooms. But there are lots of schools where they either don't have effective policies or those policies are being breached a lot of the time. So this guidance is not going to change the world, but I think it does give cover to heads who very much want to have a phone-free school and hopefully moves us in the direction to start to realise that phones, smartphones, social media are not suitable, not safe for children. They're a big distraction from learning, but more than that, they're actually changing childhood for the worse.
And Katherine, on that, of course, you run a very successful school. Is this guidance going to change your day-to-day working life at all?
Well, it won't change anything for us because it's already the case that we don't have phones in our classrooms or in the school at all. But I do think it should help those head teachers who are very keen on getting phones outside of their schools and haven't necessarily had the backing of parents or of just the general culture in the country. Having said that, I don't think that this guidance goes far enough. This is just about phones in schools. And the problem that all children struggle with and all families struggle with is that these phones take over their lives. they leave school, you will find that they can be on the phone for 8 hours every day. And you wonder, well, how is that possible? If you leave school at 4 o'clock, how are you doing that? They're up until 2 a.m. They're on the phones all of the time, accessing the most horrible, worrying stuff that affects their mental health, makes them deeply unhappy, stops them from learning, doing their homework, spending time with family and so on. And I really would want government to ban phones and social media for children under the age of 16.
And I do want to talk about that very, very shortly. But just before we do, Katherine, I just wondered how much, if we're just thinking about the classroom in terms of this specific policy, obviously you're not seeing it in your classroom given the ban, but how much of an issue do you think it is in terms of pupils using phones at school generally?
I think it's massive. So I think even in schools where the official policy is for phones to be banned, you never know what's going on in various classrooms. And sometimes some teachers, because they have difficulty controlling the class, they'll let the kids go on the phones because, well, if the naughty kids are on the phones, it keeps them quiet, you see. So they let them put the earphones on and they let them listen to music, and it just means a bit of an easier life. And I don't think we can underestimate just how much that's happening across the country in our classrooms, while at the same time, we claim that the schools have banned the phones. And it could be very much that the head believes that the phones are banned, but that actually what's happening in classrooms is that those phones are coming out because it makes the lives of teachers a little bit easier.
And Miriam, to go to Katherine's previous point, which is about whether this goes far enough, I'm guessing you are also in her camp and saying actually things could go a lot further in terms of general smartphone use in children.
Yes, absolutely. And I think Katherine said it before, other head teachers have said this, even if you don't have phones in school, a lot of the problems in schools with bullying and children falling out and much worse than that are being caused by social media, by the kind of materials that they're looking at outside of school. So even if you could say, never again will there be a smartphone in a school, these problems wouldn't stop exactly because of the reasons that Katherine said. And I think we've got to deal with the practical reality here. It's all very well saying, the heads should keep phones out of schools, and some effectively do. But think about this. These phones cost over £1,000, some of them. Children are very reluctant to hand them over and will hide them so they don't have to. Parents often don't want the child to hand over the phone. Now, I know of a primary school where kids hide their phones in their coat pockets so they can keep checking their notifications throughout the day. Are we really expecting a head teacher in a school with 2,000 pupils to search every child before they go in? That's realistically what we're talking about. Now, there may be some schools where they can do that, but there's a lot where they can't. And that's why the issue actually is that children have these smartphones at all, that we've allowed them to become addicted to them and the content that's on them. And unless you take them out of childhood altogether, it's going to be very difficult to create an effective policy in all but a handful of schools. And that's why I think, and I know Katherine has a similar point of view, that actually social media and smartphones are not safe for children at all. And I think the data is increasingly showing that, whether you look at suicide, self-harm, pornography, that's a massive issue. We're now seeing child-on-child sexual assaults, children copying what they've seen on porn. Now, none of this material should be seen by children at school or at home. And that's why there seems to be a growing consensus, not just amongst some politicians, but actually parents of children who've been victims to this, people in the media who just think enough's enough. Childhood is being ruined by these devices. Let's go back to an offline childhood.
People don't realize if you're not with children day in, day out, you don't see the damage that's being done. In fact, even at our school, we're super strict. We don't have phones. It's, the best environment that you would find in a school for no phones. And yet there's a boy I just had a conversation with. He's in year 11. He's got his exams in a few weeks. He needs to do X, Y, and Z today. He didn't want to do it. And I was saying, just give me your phone, because he needs to give me his phone. And I said, just give it to me. You have my word. You will have it back at the end of the day. You just hand it over to me. He said, no, he just wouldn't let go of it. He just can't let go of it because he's so addicted to it. It's like a safety blanket. And the thing is that the addiction, I've seen children cry saying, I'm so addicted, I don't know what to do. Can somebody please help me? And the problem is that you warn parents, as teachers, we warn parents before, And they don't necessarily listen because they think, oh, come on, Miss Birbalsingh's just being a bit too strict, or she's being a bit silly. And then 3 years later, they come to me and they say, I don't know what to do. My child's involved in criminal activity. My girl has met a 25-year-old man and is talking to him, and I don't know how to get her away from him. They come and tell me they're watching these horrible videos, or they're involved in the kind of chat which is so it is so shocking, the language that they use, the stuff that they might talk about. They talk about raping babies and they see this sort of thing. This is what they're seeing. It changes who they are. And parents who then do listen and take the phones away from their children. So they've given them the phone. Child has had the phone for a couple of years. They take the phone away. What the parents always say is, I've got my boy back. He's back to being his lovely, innocent self. But because if you're the only person, this is why I welcome the guidance about schools, but I wish it went further than this. If you're a head teacher trying to make these arguments to parents, the parents sort of think, oh, you're just a bit loopy. You just seem a bit extreme in the things that you're saying. And I'm saying, you got to believe me. I've seen this happen. If you were to talk to my kids who are 15, 16, you'll see it. And their child who's 11, who seems he's very sweet because he's still 11 years old. He's in year 7. His phone isn't such a big deal at that point. The parents cannot imagine what's going to happen over the years. And then by the time they realize it, it's too late. That is the big problem.
Miriam, how would a smartphone ban actually work in practice? Because obviously it's all very well to say, oh, they're dangerous, they have all these problems. If you look at what's happened to children with overuse, some children going on paths they wouldn't have otherwise. But are we talking about an age limit on smartphones, just as you have with alcohol? Are we talking about something where you have more enforced age limits on social media, on the dark web, not that you can really have it there? How would you see it actually working?
Well, I think we need a multi-pronged approach. So first of all, on the social media, it should be possible to have an age limit of 16. We currently have an age limit of 13. That's not kept to at the moment, but the Online Safety Act, in theory, when it's fully operational, will impose severe penalties on social media firms for allowing under 13s onto their platforms. I don't see why that couldn't be raised to under 16s. It's certainly legislatively possible, and I do think that's possible. So that's one angle. In terms of the smartphone ban, do you have an age limit? Do you have a prohibition on sale? That does need more work, unquestionably, from politicians, from lawyers. But I think really we've got to get to the place where the majority of policymakers, public intellectuals, educationalists agree that we should be banning these devices. And I think it's really interesting to look at the attitude we've taken to tech over the last 10 or 15 years, which is so laissez-faire compared to anything else, drugs, alcohol, even allowing children into playgrounds. You look at the kind of safety features that there are in playgrounds. It's absurd how physically safe we now keep our children. And yet we've almost said, oh, they'll be fine on tech. We can't stifle the tech companies' creativity. We can't get in the way of their market share. I mean, it's absurd when you think about the kind of harms that have been done to children. And this is what we've got to do first. We've got to convince politicians and policymakers that actually we shouldn't be giving the tech companies a free pass here. We shouldn't be saying that, yes, of course, kids are fine on their phone. We've got to agree that they're not. That's the first step. Then we can talk about, well, practically, legislatively, what does it look like to have a ban? How do we get people to adhere to that? How do we win hearts and minds? Let's be honest, because we've got to convince parents and to some extent young people that this is in their long-term best interests.
Yeah. The thing to remember is that Steve Jobs, in 2010, when a journalist asked him about iPads and his kids, he said, obviously, I'm not giving iPads to my kids. That would be crazy. Bill Gates wouldn't allow data to his children on their phones until they were 16. All of the big tech guys in California who fly around on private jets, thanks to the money that we are spending on smartphones and apps and so on for our children, we are funding their very nice lifestyles while they protect their own children from this stuff. And they really do. They understand the damage that it's doing. And when I think about my poor families in Wembley, ordinary families in the inner city who save up all their money to give their child a birthday present, which is actually going to destroy their children's lives in order to make these fat cats even richer, and while they protect their own children, it makes me so angry. The fact is we ban all sorts of things for children. It's not, they don't have just access to drugs, for instance, pharmaceutical drugs. drugs. They can't, a parent needs to decide that. Alcohol, sex, marriage, driving, smoking. There are so many things that we ban from them. And we ban them because we understand that children are not mature enough and able to make the right decisions when it comes to these things. The mental health problems that happen thanks to these phones are they've exploded. Jonathan Haidt in America, a psychologist and writer, fantastic on this. Jean Twenge, again, she's written books about this. There are all kinds of studies that have been done about this. I see it anecdotally, and that's just mental health. Then there is the learning that they can do. I can tell you anecdotally, my kids in the top set don't have phones because we convince our parents not to give their children phones. And the vast majority of children in the top set do not own a phone at all. And I can tell you, all of my bottom sets have phones. Not only do they have phones, but they're on their phones for 6 to 8 hours a day. So any parents who are listening, honestly, if you care about what kind of grades your children are going to get at GCSE and A-level, don't give them a phone.
And Katherine, just picking up on what you were saying there about how you have plenty of, banned things for children, drugs, alcohol. Would you put smartphones on a par with illegal drugs?
Yes. In fact, the thing about, smoking some hashish is that you smoke it and then that's it. With a phone, you get immediately addicted. You ruin your life with that. Honestly, when I say you ruin your life, look, there's some people who'll be listening to this thinking, oh, isn't that a bit of an exaggeration? My child had a phone and they were okay. You can survive it, right? Just like you can survive smoking drugs. And you'll be, there are people who smoke drugs and they just partake in it a little bit and it's recreational and it's okay. But the fact is, there is a huge addiction problem there. And for children who are a little bit more vulnerable, who are special needs, who are they're more followers instead of leaders, who are easily taken in by the nonsense that happens online. And that, frankly, is the majority of children. You might have an exceptional child and you might be a parent who has managed it and it's been okay, but it's got worse and worse. Since the invention of TikTok, for instance, people don't know. So if you had a child and who's now 18, you don't know what it is to have survived TikTok. It becomes something, it destroys their attention span. So they're unable to read a book properly because you need to have an imagination and the ability to be able to read something and it slowly process in your brain. Whereas if you're used to 15-second clips and then moving to the next one, and there's some explosion, there's some kind of funny thing that makes you laugh, that then becomes your go-to and your expectation of what life should be like. And you literally are just breaking your children's brains.
And Miriam, just finally, I suppose the counter to this, and I think you got involved with a little bit of a debate on this on social media regarding a Times column this week, is, well, actually, smartphones, it's not as though adults are, immune to the vices that come with smartphones. You can't really put the genie back in the bottle. All this stuff exists. It's going to be really hard to limit it. One child's always going to be able to get access to it and show their friends. So perhaps it's better to embrace it rather than trying to ban things now.
Well, I don't agree with that. And I think that's because, for exactly the reasons Katherine said, we accept as a society that there are certain freedoms that children just can't have because they're not capable of using them safely. So alcohol is the obvious thing. Of course, adults should be able to drink. Does that mean some will abuse it and some will cause themselves harm? Yes, it does. But the majority of adults are able to control that behaviour, to use alcohol in a safe way and enjoy it and benefit from it. But we wouldn't suggest that a child aged 11 could walk into a pub or a supermarket and buy alcohol because they don't have the maturity to be able to regulate their behaviour. They're much more susceptible to peer pressure in terms of taking risks and things like that. We just accept that a child's brain is not developed enough to use that particular freedom safely, and therefore they can't have it. And I think that's exactly the same with smartphones. They're just too addictive. Now, of course, we have to bring children up knowing how to use the internet safely, how to use, the basic tools of word processing and things like that safely. But we're not arguing that we shouldn't be doing that. And of course, children will need access to desktop computers and things like that, of course. But that's entirely different to having the internet in your pocket 24 hours a day and that addictive factor and also the private nature of it. We've not even touched on the fact that these phones have cameras, that they can stream video, I think for the first time last year, the majority of child sexual abuse images of 7 to 10-year-olds that the Internet Watch Foundation found online were self-generated. That means children aged 7 to 10 filming their own sexual abuse live on the internet for groomers. Now, that's because it's private and you've got a camera and you can do it anywhere behind a closed door. Those are the kind of features of a smartphone that are inappropriate for children, but we're not saying you can't use a desktop computer to word process an essay. There's a difference in the level of harm. So I just don't think there is any safe level of smartphone use for a child, and that's why we need regulation. But that's an entirely different thing to say that all phones are bad, all internet's bad, there aren't benefits to things. There are, but you have to be an adult to know how to use that safely, or try, because many of us are addicted to our phones, let's be honest.
Yes.
So Miriam, for parents watching now who are perhaps worried about, their children being on smartphones, perhaps after this discussion and the various issues raised, is your advice, and Katherine, perhaps yours too, to get a Nokia 3210 for your child, that type of phone if you want to keep in touch with them but don't want them exposed to these various things?
Well, I am one of those parents. I have teenagers, and I think sometimes you read people in, let's say, more libertarian publications saying this is just parents' fault. But the pressure on a child, on a parent, if you're the only teenager in your class without a smartphone, you do not have a social life. And that's why we need action from government. Yes, of course, parents are partners. Of course, schools are partners. Absolutely. But this is why we need regulation. Imagine if you sent your child to school every day, knowing that there were Class A drugs all over the desk, but said to your child, no, don't take them, don't take them, don't take them. How many parents are going to be successful? That's the situation we're in. So I would just say to parents, I sympathise. It's terrible. It's awful. That's why we do need some help.
I mean, we actually sell those brick phones at school, and I sell them at a loss. We make a loss at the school so that we subsidize, because I know it's the number one thing that will help a child to get them on a brick phone instead of a smartphone. And I explain this to the parents, and a number of the parents do then understand. And we do get the highest progress rate in terms of results. We've done so for the last 2 years in the country. I will absolutely stand by the fact that I think one of the reasons why we manage that is because some of our kids do not have phones at all.
Thank you, Katherine. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you for joining Spectator TV. That's it for this week. Once again, if you enjoy Spectator TV, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of the video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thank you again for watching, and do join us again next week.